Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to go through how to paint this beautiful silhouette painting using watercolors. And this painting is of an elk with a beautiful starry galaxy night sky. So the materials I'll be using for this will be my Cotman watercolor set. You can use any watercolors that you have, whether they're in a pan or a tube, it doesn't matter, just use any watercolor paints that you have. I will also be using some white gouache, and this will be great for creating the starry effect, and I'll be applying this with a flat paintbrush. Again, you can use white acrylic for this instead if you want. I've also got a tea towel for blotting my paint, and I use 2 jars of water so that I don't have to change them as often. You can use any watercolor paintbrushes that you have as well. I use round paintbrushes, and I also like to tape down my paper. The paper that I'm using is the Fabriano Artistico watercolor paper, and this is cold pressed paper and it's £140, but I will leave all of the materials in the description below. And for some final details, I'll be using colour pencils. But let's get straight into the tutorial. So I start off by mixing up the colours that I want to use for the night sky. So I mix up a really bright pink, a purple colour. I also go and mix up 2 blues, so I mix up a lighter blue, and I make sure my colours are nice and vibrant, and then I mix up a darker blue as well so that we can get a really nice intense dark night sky. For the night sky, I'm going to be using the wet on wet watercolour technique. So this is where you pre-wet your paper first, just using clean water. And I'm pre-wetting the whole top half of my paper. I've already got my sketch outline down. I just sketched out the elk and the ground. And once I've wet the surface of the paper, I just start tapping in those watercolors that I've mixed up. And as you can see, they nicely bleed out into that wet surface. And the wet and wet technique is brilliant if you want to avoid getting any harsh edges, because the colours do bleed out beautifully into each other because of that wet surface. So if you ever are painting something where you need a really smooth transition of colours, for example, if you are painting a portrait, then I really recommend using this technique. I started off by adding in the pink, and then I moved on to adding in purple and then the blues towards the top of the sky. The pink was more towards the bottom middle portion of the sky around the elk, and then it went from the purple and then into the blue, and the blue was further up and more around the corners as well. I then go in with some more intense purples, and I really start to darken up the sky by going in with some dark blues as well. But with this part, you can really just go in and have fun with it and experiment. I also intensify the colours a bit more using that really dark blue that we mixed up, and I target this colour around the edges and corners of the painting. Keep going back and forth, adding in more purples and pinks until you're happy with the intensity of your night sky. To get darker colours, mix in less water. Also, with my reference, the elk had like a cold breath, so you can see cold air coming from the elk's mouth. And to create this effect, I used a clean damp brush just to lift up some of that wet watercolour. Now moving on to creating the really cool starry effect. And this is actually really easy to do if you use a flat brush, or if you don't have that, you can use an old toothbrush that you're obviously not using to clean your teeth anymore. And what you do is you just dip this flat brush into your gouache or white acrylic, whatever you're using. And then if you flick the brush with your finger, you can see that it creates a beautiful starry effect. And so I make sure that my gouache is a little bit thinner, so I mix in a bit of water so that it can work really well. And then I just flick it all over the sky. And this is a great technique because it creates a lot of variety in the sizes of the stars. As you can see, we have some really tiny ones and also some bigger splatters as well. And this helps to create a really natural looking night sky. I also use that gouache to intensify that misty cold air around the elk's mouth as well. Now, before we move on to painting in the silhouette, if you want to follow along with this tutorial in real time, as well as get access to over 300 other real-time tutorials for not only watercolor, but for charcoal and color pencil as well, then over on my Patreon, you can get access to all of these tutorials for a small amount per month. But if a monthly membership isn't right for you, or you just want to master painting with watercolors, then over on my website I've got lots of individual courses to help you master painting with watercolors. I've got a great one on there that you should check out called Expressive Animals in Watercolor, where you can learn loads of really different cool techniques that you can apply to your watercolor paintings. I've also got some watercolor tutorials on there for painting hair and portraits, as well as lots of other useful courses. If you are interested in any of my courses, then you can use the code SAVE15 at checkout to get 15% off any of my courses. So I'll leave a link to my Patreon and my website in the description below. But let's get straight back into the tutorial. Now that we've created that beautiful night sky, it's time to paint in the silhouette. And all I'm using for this is black watercolor paint. And I make sure that the paint is really nice and thick so that we get a really opaque, dark silhouette effect. If you mix in too much water, then it's not going to be dark enough and it's just going to be a weird grey colour. So make sure that you're only mixing in enough water to get it to flow nicely onto the paper, but try and keep it as thick as you can. I like to use a really small paintbrush when I'm painting in my silhouettes, especially if I'm painting in really small areas and small details like I did with the antlers. And I like to go in and just follow the outline that I've previously drawn for my sketch outline. When I'm doing a sketch outline, if ever I'm painting a silhouette, I make sure that I do my sketch slightly darker, because like with this example, I did the sky overlapping some of the elk. So if I did my sketch outline really light, then it would have simply disappeared after I added that first wash of watercolor for the sky. So if I'm doing a silhouette, then it's okay to make your sketch outline a little darker so that you can see it when you go to filling in that object, that area with black paint. And that's all I do. I simply fill in that sketch outline that we created with the black paint. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you're 100% happy with your sketch outline before you go in and add your watercolors, because all you're doing is filling in the sketch outline. So you need to make sure that it's really accurate so that your silhouette looks really good. I also filled in the ground with the black paint, and you can use a slightly larger brush for this because you're just covering in a large area. I only use a really small detailed brush if I'm going around tiny details like the elk's legs or the antlers. I go in with the second layer of the black paint just to make sure it's really opaque before moving on to painting in some details. In the reference, I could see lots of little bits of tall grass and crop, so I really wanted to get them in to make it look nice and detailed and to make the painting a little more interesting. So to do this, I loaded up my brush with a little bit of paint, not too much because I wanted to get really thin lines, and I just carefully created these little bits of grass. I tried to make them nice and varied by doing them different lengths and curving them in different directions, and you can see that some bits of the grass have little bits of leaves on them and some do look more like crops. The key really is to add variety when you're doing this, especially with a silhouette painting, because if you do all of the bits of grass exactly the same length and going in exactly the same direction and not overlapping at all, then it's going to look really uniformed and boring. And to make sure that our silhouette doesn't look boring, it's so important and vital that we add variety in there. So do some bits of the grass slightly thicker, some really thin. And then once you've done that, we can just go in and add in a few final details using our colored pencils. But this step is completely optional. You're not really missing out on anything if you don't use this step, or you could just do this step with watercolors. But basically all I do is I go in with a couple of colored pencils for the sky, so a dark blue, and I go in with a pink as well. And I just go around and try to define that cold mist of air coming out of the elk's mouth, specifically underneath it to add more shadow so that it really pops. And you can also use it to bring more vibrancy to the sky as well. And that's really how I use the pink colored pencil in a minute. So I use it to intensify and add more saturation to the painting so that it really does stand out and look really, really pretty. I also do go in and use a really light blue. I use a turquoise blue to add a bit of shadow on top of the white gouache for that cold, misty air as well. And this just helps to add a bit of contrast and depth to that cloud of air, because at the moment it's just one shade of white, so I'm just adding a bit of detail. But here is the final result. I really hope you enjoyed this painting tutorial. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.